August 24th, 1814. The capital of the United States is empty, not abandoned, evacuated. 50 miles away, 4,000 British soldiers are marching toward this house. They've already burned their way through Maryland. 2 years earlier, the United States declared war on the most powerful empire on earth. The reasoning seemed sound at the time. Britain was fighting Napoleon across Europe. Their navy was stopping American ships, impressing sailors into British service. The Western territories were in chaos. British-backed Native American confederations were resisting American expansion. Congress saw opportunity in Britain's distraction. They miscalculated. The War of 1812 was supposed to be quick. American forces would sweep into Canada, while Britain was occupied with France. Instead, American invasions failed repeatedly. Detroit fell within weeks. The Niagara Campaign collapsed by 1814. Napoleon was defeated. Britain could turn its full attention to North America, and Britain was furious. The British military establishment viewed the American Declaration as betrayal. While they fought for civilization against Napoleon, their former colonies stabbed them in the back. This wasn't just war. This was discipline. A lesson taught to children who forgot their place. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane commanded British naval forces in North America. His brother had been killed fighting Americans. His orders from London were explicit: bring hard war to the United States, destroy military targets, burn infrastructure, make the cost of this war unbearable. In August 1814, a fleet carrying 4,000 veteran soldiers sailed into Chesapeake Bay. These weren't colonial garrison troops. These were Wellington's invincibles, men who'd marched from Portugal to France, who'd broken Napoleon's armies at Vittoria and Toulouse. They'd seen the inside of burning cities before. They were led by General Robert Ross, 47 years old, professional. Methodical. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to execute orders. The target was Washington, D.C., a city of 8,000 people, barely a town by European standards. But symbols matter more than size. This was the American capital, the physical embodiment of the Republic, and it was almost completely undefended. President James Madison knew the British were coming. Everyone knew. Ships had been spotted. Troops were landing. But knowing and believing are different things. Washington was 90 miles from the ocean. The roads were poor. Moving an army that distance seemed unlikely. Surely the British would target Baltimore instead. A real city, a naval port, an economic prize. Madison believed in American militia, the citizen soldier defending his homeland. It was foundational mythology. Farmers and shopkeepers had defeated the British once before. Surely they could do it again. Secretary of War John Armstrong agreed. He thought the British wouldn't dare march on Washington. He refused to prepare adequate defenses. Even as reports came in of British troops moving inland, Armstrong dismissed the threat. By the time the administration realized their mistake, it was too late. On August 24th, American forces finally assembled to block the British advance. 6,000 militia gathered at Bladensburg, Maryland, 6 miles from Washington. They outnumbered the British. They held defensive positions on high ground. They had artillery. None of it mattered. The Battle of Bladensburg lasted 2 hours. The American lines collapsed almost immediately. Most militia had never been in combat. They faced professional soldiers advancing in formation, using battlefield tactics refined over 20 years of European war. The British moved like machinery, relentless, efficient. American forces broke and ran. Officers tried to rally them. A few units stood and fought. Most just fled. The roads to Washington filled with running men. President Madison was there. He'd ridden out to observe the battle. The President of the United States watched his army disintegrate. Then he turned his horse and rode back to the capital ahead of the rout. By late afternoon, the road to Washington was open. General Ross didn't even pause. His army marched straight through Bladensburg and kept moving. The British were coming, and nothing stood in their way. Dolly Madison, the president's wife, stayed at the executive mansion until the last possible moment. While the president met with generals and cabinet members, she organized the evacuation of national treasures, the original copy of the Declaration of Independence. George Washington's portrait, the full-length Lansdowne painting hanging in the dining room. The servants wanted to unscrew the frame. Too slow. Dolly ordered them to break it. They smashed the frame and cut the canvas from the stretcher. The portrait of the first president was rolled up and smuggled out of the city in a wagon. The dinner she'd prepared sat cooling on the table, 40 places set. Wine bottles opened. She'd been expecting guests, cabinet members, officers, advisors, a normal Wednesday evening dinner. Instead, she fled in a carriage with whatever documents and valuables could be carried. The city emptied in chaos. Government clerks grabbed what papers they could, families loaded wagons, people fled on foot. By evening, Washington was a ghost town. General Ross and his army entered the capital at dusk. No resistance, no defenders, just empty streets and abandoned buildings. They'd marched over 50 miles in 2 days in August heat. They'd fought a battle that afternoon. Now they stood in the enemy capital, and the question became, what next? The rules of war in 1814 were clear but flexible. Military targets were legitimate. Public buildings could be destroyed. Private property was theoretically protected. But cities that resisted could be punished. And the British considered this entire war an act of rebellion. Ross made his decision quickly. Destroy the public buildings, send the message, make the cost real. They started with the Capitol building. The original structure, the Senate and House chambers, connected by a wooden walkway. British soldiers piled furniture in the rooms, books from the Library of Congress, desks, chairs, everything flammable. Then they set it ablaze. The Capitol burned through the night. The sandstone walls cracked from the heat. The copper roof melted. 2,000 books turned to ash. The chambers where American laws were debated became furnaces. Next came the president's mansion. The dinner was still on the table. British officers sat down and ate it. They drank Madison's wine. They toasted the king. Then they piled the furniture and set the house on fire. The flames consumed the interior completely. The sandstone walls survived, but everything inside was destroyed. The mansion where American presidents had lived for 14 years became a burned shell. The Treasury building, torched. The War Department, burned. The State Department, destroyed along with diplomatic correspondence and archives. Private buildings were mostly spared. A few exceptions, a newspaper that had been particularly anti-British, a rope walk that produced naval supplies. But mostly, Ross kept his soldiers focused on government targets. All night, Washington burned. The sky glowed orange for miles. People who'd fled to the countryside turned and watched their capital city die in fire. Then the weather intervened. August 25th brought a storm unlike anything most had witnessed. The temperature dropped, the sky turned black. Wind hit with sudden violence. Then came the rain. Not normal rain. Torrential, biblical. Water came down in sheets. The wind reached hurricane force. Buildings that survived the fires had roofs torn off. Chimneys collapsed. Trees were ripped from the ground. A tornado touched down in the center of Washington. It tore through the streets where British soldiers were stationed. Men were lifted and thrown. Cannons, massive iron pieces weighing thousands of pounds, were flipped over. Several British soldiers were killed by flying debris. The storm lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the fires were out. The city was flooded. Debris was everywhere. General Ross surveyed the damage. His mission was complete. The symbolic targets were destroyed. His army was intact, but exhausted. Staying longer served no purpose. On August 25th, the British withdrew from Washington and marched back to their ships. They'd held the American capital for exactly 26 hours. President Madison returned to find his capital in ruins. The executive mansion was a blackened shell. The capital was gutted, the infrastructure of government was ash and rubble, but the city wasn't destroyed. The storm that scattered the British also saved Washington from total devastation. Private homes mostly stood. The population began returning. Within days, government functions resumed in temporary buildings. The psychological damage was worse than the physical. The American capital had fallen without real resistance. The militia had collapsed. The president had fled. The British had marched in, burned the symbolic heart of the Republic, and left. Madison's administration faced calls for resignation. Critics blamed him for the war, for the lack of preparation, for the humiliation. But Madison refused to step down. Congress refused to relocate the capital, despite suggestions to move to Philadelphia or somewhere more defensible. The burned mansion was rebuilt. The walls were painted white to cover the smoke damage. It became, officially now, the White House. The Capitol was reconstructed, larger, grander, a statement that the Republic would not be intimidated. The war dragged on for another 4 months. The British attack on Baltimore failed, Fort McHenry held, inspiring Francis Scott Key to write what became the national anthem. Fighting in the South proved inconclusive. Both sides were exhausted. On Christmas Eve 1814, diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war. Neither side gained territory. No major issues were resolved. The impressment of sailors, the original cause, wasn't even mentioned. The war just stopped. News traveled slowly. In January 1815, Andrew Jackson won a stunning victory at New Orleans. 2 weeks after peace was signed, Americans celebrated it as redemption. The humiliation of Washington was balanced by triumph in New Orleans. The war became mythologized as the Second War of Independence. The narrative focused on American victories, not defeats. The burning of Washington was framed as temporary setback before ultimate triumph. But the reality was simpler. The United States picked a fight it couldn't win, survived, and learned crucial lessons about military preparedness and national defense. Today, you can tour the White House. You can walk through the Capitol. These buildings feel permanent, eternal, obvious. The physical manifestation of American government seems solid, inevitable. But in 1814, they were just buildings. And buildings burn. The burning of Washington revealed something fundamental about power and symbols. The British destroyed the structures, but the Republic survived. The government functioned from temporary quarters. Congress still met. The president still led. Because the buildings weren't the Republic. They were just where the Republic happened to live. The British understood this. The burning was symbolic violence, a demonstration of power, a humiliation designed to break American will. It failed because symbols only have the power we give them. The Americans rebuilt. They painted the mansion white. They made the Capitol bigger. They turned a moment of defeat into a story about resilience. But here's the question that echoes forward. What happens when the symbols of government become more important than the functions? When the buildings, the monuments, the physical spaces become sacred, while the principles they supposedly represent become negotiable? In 1814, the Republic survived because people valued the idea more than the building. The structure burned, but the system continued. Could that happen now? If the symbols fell, would we remember what they're supposed to represent? Or have we spent so long protecting the buildings that we've forgotten what was supposed to happen inside them? The British burned the White House once. The Republic survived. But it survived because enough people believed the Republic was bigger than any building could contain. That it lived in principles, not architecture, in ideas, not monuments. Do you still believe that? Or have the symbols become the thing itself? The answer matters, because buildings always burn eventually. The only question is whether what they represent survives the fire.